Welcome to the fall semester 2023. I hope you had a great summer and that you're healthy and in a happy place. I present to you our studio project, Lawlux Care. But first, please meet Marjorie Tello-1, Marge, who will be the graduate assistant for our studio. She is on this Zoom call as well and can answer questions after the presentation or in the chat. Last fall, Marge was in our studio and did a fantastic job. Here you see her and her work at the final review. The studio is called Lawlux Care. Lawlux stands for low income, high luxury urban housing. CARE stands for an integrated housing community that provides homes and services for children that are cared for by people who are not their biological parents. So both terms, Lawlux and CARE, point to the social and economic dimension in urban housing. We discuss these issues in the context of an acute housing crisis in New York City, one that has been pushed to the breaking point by the pandemic. And we discuss how these issues relate to the architectural mandate. Lawlux has been the general term we've been using for our housing studios for the past 10 years. Every year there's a different focus. This year it is foster children, Lawlux Care. But generally as a disciplinary project, Lawlux discusses socio-economic and political issues in urban housing and takes the position that architecture holds the potential for improving human coexistence in a more just society. Simply said, it assumes that we can actually make a difference. We are grateful that the events of the past few years have mobilized the architectural community to focus once more on issues of equity and inclusion. Our studio addresses equity and inclusion in two ways. First, we develop models of overcoming internal segregation in urban housing, the separation of less well-off tenants from wealthy user groups. New York City provides incentives for developers to include affordable housing units in every new construction. However, these pro forma inclusions often lead to socially questionable results. The internal building organization often separates high and low income occupants, creates essentially a rich door and a poor door. We seek to overcome this form of internal segregation by proposing a model of spatial and organizational integration. We develop hybrid topologies for low-income and luxury housing. The Lawlux Studio promotes urban housing as a space for communication, a place for informal and coincidental encounters that will foster integration and presence a new kind of urban living for a diverse group of New Yorkers. The exact definition of low and lux will be project-specific. For example, a project might redefine the notion of luxury as a measure of spatial quality or communal integration rather than an expanse of floor area. This year we are considering foster children and their caregivers as a community to serve with our proposals. Here integration refers to both the socio-economic condition as well as the diversity in living forms and housing types. The second level at which the studio addresses equity and inclusion is to propose a public common space. The space that provides open and equitable access to essential urban resources for the community at large. This year, CARE proposes social services including physical and mental health care and specialized services for children and the elderly. Before we discuss alternative housing and living forms, we want to acknowledge that much of urban housing principles have been developed with the nuclear family in mind. Here we see an image of a recent archaeological sensation that provides the earliest evidence of the nuclear family. DNA was extracted from bones and teeth in a 600-year-old Stone Age burial unearthed in Germany. The nuclear family isn't dead, but it has a lot of competition these days. Cliff Pearson writes this in his article, New Domesticities and New Realities, in the fantastic book Under Pressure, which I recommend to everybody. So he writes that 30 years ago, 40% of US households lived in a traditional family unit. Today, it's only 24%. Singles rose from 16 to 26% since then, and the category of other families jumped 10 to 15%. We are interested in the other families. We're discussing the history of foster care and contemporary models of what used to be called orphanages, including group homes and new models for foster care. Lawlux Care proposes an integrated housing community that serves foster children, children that await to be placed in foster care, and young adults who have experienced foster care in the past. It supports alternative intergenerational models of housing and living, including grandfamilies. Intergenerational communities are beginning to develop as the need grows for homes that support aging adults and the children they care for. Currently, lawmakers in the House introduced the Grand Family Housing Act, which would create a national pilot program to expand grandfamily housing. Our studio aims at providing a very timely and meaningful response to such changes in the foster care system. Our studio considers that low-income communities are disproportionately burdened by the New York City housing crisis, and it simultaneously recognizes that there is a need for integrated housing at all income levels. The site is an existing public housing project, Farquhar Houses, which is located in downtown Brooklyn, bordering Dumbo, Vinegar Hill, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We see Farquhar housing in the middle of the image, with the BQE Intercity Highway diagonally cutting through the urban fabric just adjacent to our site. To the right, we see the East River with the Manhattan and the Brooklyn Bridge embracing Dumbo, and to the right of our site, the quaint neighborhood of Vinegar Hill. The Fargate houses are separated from the rest of Brooklyn by the BQE, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, making the area relatively hard to access from the south. The effects of separating and isolating neighborhoods is apparent. The poverty-stricken area of Fargate stands in sharp contrast to the nearby blocks in Dumbo and Vinegar Hill, where the median income is $200,000 a year and apartments sell for over $1 million. We identify the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway as an instrument of displacement and segregation. Students may consider or propose alternative future scenarios for the urban roadway, including those that could reconnect and potentially heal the urban tissue. The problem of inner-city highways and how they have reinforced racial divides is not at all unique to NYC. Many cities in the country and around the world, in fact, are actively planning to reconnect neighborhoods through highway augmentation or removal. The 10 buildings of the Farragut Housing Estate were built in the early 1950s and are managed by the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA. The studio considers them a prototypical public housing project with its common challenges and opportunities as they pertain to connectivity, amenity, and land value. With this, the studio considers Fargate houses as a study site for urban densification. During the first weeks of the semester, students will develop schematic urban proposals to densify the Fargate housing site. This is certainly a site that requires an urban approach first, and it's a huge site. In order to make this very easy for students and a fun start of the semester, we lay out a catalog of urban massing strategies that students can choose from and quickly test hybrid strategies. And here we see examples of hybridizing these strategies. Combinatory logic such as networking and adding solitaires, or extending existing towers and adding infill towers. We conduct a series of massing studies that address the relationship between building form and housing type. And within your very own urban scheme, you will specify a focus site of just 50,000 square feet of integrated housing. So, for example, here we see on the top left the global urban massing scheme, and then we see on the right side the actual focus area that will be architecturally dealt with. You will be given plenty of material to understand and then to work with the existing building structure. The studio discusses critically the notion of context without relying on past conventions of contextualism. Here you see some masking models of previous LOLAC studios. They study modes of densification that are invested in the autonomous reality of the city. Interventions are assessed by the qualities that they produce, the urban qualities, not merely by the degree to which they sustain the city's current condition. New forms of densification are driven as much by the urgent necessity to create space and resilient structures for habitation, as by the desire for density itself, an inherently urban quality. How does one adapt post-war public housing developments, known colloquially and often pejoratively as projects, to a drastically changing socio-economic environment with new demands and desires for amenities, access, and public space? What are economic models that allow for such transformation in times of no political will or funding for public housing development? And how does one inspire through design a positive identity for stigmatized old structures of this kind? The studio takes a proactive approach to the idea of adaptive reuse and allows for radical urban and architectural interventions, which is forward-looking as it creates an actual new life cycle for the existing building structure. The studio introduces the idea of material urbanism, which offers a method and a disciplinary position as it refers to the materiality of the urban condition itself. It encourages deep material exploration and gives agency to material behaviors and physical models. The projects are based on organizational and aesthetic principles found in the study of emergent material expression. 6 years ago, we introduced photogrammetry as a tool for just this transposition. Here we see an example of an intentional mismapping of the photogrammetry material. The studio had also introduced 3D print casting, an exciting technique that we're continuing this semester as well. A couple of material massing examples here. Examples of speculative mediation between physical and digital material, with material alchemy playing an active part in the process. Material mathematical models, giving agency to both the material and the algorithm. Purely digital material transfer here, early GANs. And to go through the final slides here with examples of previous years very quickly. Here you see a very small excerpt of our typological studies engaging the latest AI. A rather advanced hybridization routine that is based on a thorough understanding of the primary housing mechanics, which you will be taught in the first weeks of the semester. The parent plans of this AI. Example on the left, Bertrand Goldberg, Marina City and Comte and Vollenweider House in Paris. And 4AI, options for refinement on the right. These first examples here all operate at the scale of a building plan. Alvar Otto, Hansewirdel Interbau in Berlin, and again Comte and Vollenweider House in Paris. Francisco Javier Scenes de Oise, Torre Blancas and Zaha Hadid City Life Apartments. And here Zaha with David Ajay, Sugar Hill Development. And here Francisco Javier Scenes de Oise with Paul Baumgarten Casa Eternit. This is an example of a building section hybrid. David J. Sugar Hill Development in Schlangenbad Strasse, Berlin. A project, by the way, with a very interesting historical lineage, starting the Laditz with Walter Gropius Mount in his house speculations more than 100 years ago, and including Paul Rudolph's Lower Manhattan Expressway and many other prominent precedents. And here an example at the scale of the housing unit. All these scales, urban context and massing, building type and apartment, are entirely interdependent and also deserve individual analysis. Here are a few public comments posters coming out of our studio from 2 years ago and from last year, with Marge on the left. I very much look forward to seeing you soon, probably on Wednesday, and I wish you a fantastic semester ahead.